forum then. So it's my pleasure to introduce Johanna, who I don't think needs an introduction since I think almost everybody here knows her quite well. Johanna's originally from Pennsylvania, but she's sort of a local. She did her undergraduate degree at American, just about a mile or two from here, and then she went on to Arizona to complete her Ph.D. She is our inaugural Vera Rubin Fellow, which means that she spends 2 years here, and then she'll spend 2 years at the Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena. Her 2 years here, sadly, is beginning to run out. But fortunately for me, she'll continue to work within our group, which includes Steve Scheckman and Jeff Crane in Pasadena. So I'll have even more excuses now to fly out to Los Angeles. And with that, I'll let it go.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, all right. Great. So yes, thanks, Paul, for that lovely introduction. It's my pleasure to be giving the DTM seminar finally. I've been here for 2 years as a postdoc, and then I also interned here as an undergrad, so it's my pleasure to finally get to give a seminar. And I also, one of the things I like most about DTM and the Broad Branch campus in general is how interdisciplinary it is. And so I know whenever I go to talks, I'm always excited to learn new things and hear about my colleagues' cutting edge research. And so hopefully you'll get that out of my talk today too. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge some of my collaborators. These are all people that work outside of Carnegie, but some of whom I've been working with since my PhD, as part of my PhD thesis. And then within Carnegie, I've collaborated with, as Paul mentioned, all the people on the Carnegie Planet Finding team, which includes Ian Thompson and Jeff Crane and Steve Scheckman at Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena. Matthias Diaz is a visiting graduate student from Chile. Of course, you know Paul and Pamela. And then at the end of my talk, I'll preview a new project that I've been working on with Colin and an undergraduate from the University of Maryland, Janelli, on extreme exoplanet geology. So the title of my talk is Exoplanet Genetics. So what do I mean by that? This is a maybe perhaps more familiar framework in terms of we're all humans, so we're all familiar with how all these different things interact in our own lives and through our own development to make us into the people that we are. And so you have genetics, things that you're inherited from parents or other relatives. That is also fed by environment and physiology and how you behave, how all these different things interact, sort of make you into the person that you are. And so we can also look at this framework in terms of exoplanets. And so the inside of planets, you have circulation and convection, heating and cooling. Exoplanets also behave differently. Some of them migrate inwards or are scattered away from their star or towards their star. If they're close enough, their atmospheres can evaporate due to radiation from their star. They also experience peer influence and stress from perhaps other planets or other stars. And I'll talk about binary exoplanet host stars in this talk. And then, of course, there's what I'll focus on really is host stars. They're kind of the genetic component feeding the development and growth of exoplanets. And I'm broadly interested in how all of these things contribute to the development of exoplanets and potentially habitability and life. So zooming in a little bit on a more specific question, how do we learn about exoplanet composition? I like this flowchart because it sort of shows how you start with observations, which are the light gray boxes at the top, and I've also added disk spectra in there because I think those are also important. And then the darker gray boxes are how you interpret those observations, and then under that is all the different things that you can potentially learn about exoplanets from these different observations. So before I sort of zoom in even further on stellar spectra, I just wanted to go over very quickly how other exoplanet observations help us understand what they're made of. So first, with planet mass and radius, we can measure planet masses through the rate of velocity technique that Paul has pioneered. Radii we can get from transiting exoplanets, so when they pass in front of their host star, you can measure the dip in the star's light and get the ratio of the planet's radius to the star radius. And with a mass and radius, you can get an exoplanet density, so maybe tells you something about the bulk composition. But these actually turn out to be a little bit degenerate. And so if you look in the bottom plot, I'm showing how for a planet of a certain mass, either 1 Earth mass, that's what this little symbol here means, or 5 Earth masses, for these planets that have the same mass and very similar radii, it can be hard to distinguish between their compositions. So here I have pure iron planets, silicate planets, and carbon planets, and they all have very similar radii. So knowing those two things might not tell you that much about composition. Then on the right, I have a ternary diagram from Valencia et al. 2013 from Super Earth GJ1214b. And here, this is actually, we have pretty good, some of the best radius and mass constraints on the Super Earth, but still the composition is only constrained to be about 10%, or excuse me, less than 10% hydrogen helium by mass, and can span the rest of this composition space that includes water and Earth-like nucleus composition. So otherwise, there's a wide range in possible composition. And then the plot up here on the top is showing the case of when you have one Earth radius, one Earth mass planet, but varying errors in the mass. So a 10% error is in kind of the darker shaded box, and a 20% error is in the lighter shaded box. And this gives you different core to basically planet mantle ratios, which can vary within the 10% error radius from something like 60 or 0.6 to 0.4. But for most exoplanets, the mass error is more like 20%. And so then you get a very big difference between something like 0.7 and 0.25 core to mantle ratio, which I think everyone here can appreciate would be a big difference. And for a lot of exoplanets, we don't have both mass and radius measurements. So this is a plot that I made just yesterday from exoplanets.org. Some of the points in this plot are missing errors in the mass, but you can see in this sort of 1 to 10 Earth mass regime, there aren't that many exoplanets that have been detected, first of all, that have both masses and radii. And for a lot of them, they're just very large errors. And so even if you're trying to plot composition curves on here based on density, it might not be that informative. So that's mass and radius. Now I'll move on to exoplanet atmospheric spectra. And there are a couple different ways we can learn about exoplanet atmospheres. One I already mentioned was the transit method, where the planet passes in front of the star or behind it. You can measure the stellar flux coming through its atmosphere, or the dayside flux of the planet. And you can do this at different wavelengths and get sort of a rough spectrum of the planet. There's also what some people work on here, direct imaging, which you're literally taking a picture of the planet close to its host star. And so here's an example of the beta PIC system. So you have this extended disk, and zooming in, here's an image from a recent paper by the MAG-AO team, including TJ Rodegas and Alicia Weinberger, where they were trying to constrain basically the temperature and radius and intrinsic luminosity of the planet in the beta PIC-B system. But for a lot of the direct imaging observations, those are, at least so far, only around more massive stars, and the planets themselves are very young because they still have to be luminous. And for the transmission or emission spectroscopy, a lot of that work has been done only on these hot Jupiter exoplanets. So here's a paper from just this year showing a nice suite of these photometric and spectral measurements of transmission coming from hot Jupiter atmospheres. But again, those are giant planets. If I'm really focused in on understanding habitable planets, these are not habitable. And for these super Earth planets, which are slightly smaller and could potentially push into the rocky regime, at least so far, a lot of their atmospheric spectra seem to be very flat. We can't really distinguish any features, molecular features in their spectra. So now I will convince you why stellar spectra and understanding stellar abundances can also tell us something about exoplanet composition. I don't mean to say that these are worthless. I think they're very valuable. This is what I've been working on, and I think it's an additional way to learn about exoplanet composition. So we know from host star abundances at this point, there's a pretty robust correlation between the presence of giant planets and the metallicity of the host star, which is parameterized often by the amount of iron in the star. And so this Fe over H is the iron versus hydrogen in the star. The little bracket notation means relative to the sun. And so in this plot, and in any plot that has that bracket notation, the sun is at the 0 mark. So here, you can see that the red dashed line shows the metallicity distribution of the stars that host giant planets. Most of them are pretty close in. And it's skewed towards higher metallicities. So those stars have more iron than the sun. And then the distribution shown by the solid blue line, which are super Earth and Neptune hosts, which is less skewed. And then the dotted black line is stars without planets, which is almost centered around 0. And I have without in quotes because this plot is from a paper in 2012, which was about 1 or 2 years into the Kepler mission. And at this point, we know from Kepler that most stars host small planets. And so really this black dotted distribution is more like stars with small planets. So that's what I mean by the text on the side. Smaller planet host stars don't seem to show this preference in terms of metallicity. This is sort of still debated. I don't want to go into the details here, but, there we go. These are examples of two papers that use basically the same data set from the Kepler mission and come to different conclusions. This one is suggesting there's a small enhancement in the probability of detecting small planets around higher metallicity stars. Definitely for the giant planets, there's this big enhancement, whereas another paper suggested, no, there's no difference between stars that host small planets and stars that are not known to host small planets. So there's no preference. So that's, I think, still an open question, one that I'm interested in exploring more. But really, all of this points towards core accretion, favored method of planet formation, at least for a lot of planets, maybe not all. This is a simulation from John Chambers that he shared with me, and this is showing a simulation of our solar system and small planets, but the same idea sort of applies for larger planets, which is disks that have their host stars larger heavy element content, have a higher rate of grain planetesimal conversion, and so that allows the giant planet cores to grow faster and accrete gas to build up a large atmosphere while there's still gas left in the disk, and so that's why they are preferentially around more iron-rich or metal-rich stars. But there's a lot of elements besides iron, and I don't think I really appreciated this plot until I came to DTM, and it's showing the solar abundance of different elements versus the abundance in CI chondrites. And you can see that for a lot of elements, there's a remarkably tight correlation, especially for some of these refractory elements that I'll be talking about. And so that's what I'm interested in, going beyond just iron and that planet metallicity correlation, and looking at what else the host star might be able to tell us. And so I'll talk about a little bit about why the carbon to oxygen ratio in exoplanets is interesting, and how we can measure in stars, but why that's challenging. Then I'll move on to talking about some other elements and what they might be able to tell us about giant planet interiors. Then I'll try to also convince you why binary stars are interesting and important for understanding planet composition and formation. And then at the end, I'll show some fun pictures from what we've been doing in the basement over in the research building with extreme exoplanet geology. So first, why is the carbon to oxygen ratio interesting in hot Jupiter exoplanets? Why would we want to measure it in them? Sort of flipping that question on its head, it's something that we can potentially measure, so that's why it's interesting, or one of the reasons why it's interesting. The top plot here is showing a typical spectrum of a cooler exoplanet, something like 500 Kelvin, versus the one on the bottom is showing a typical hot Jupiter temperature exoplanet, something like 1500 Kelvin. And you can see there, just looking at the difference between sort of this yellow, orangey, squiggly line and the blue squiggly line, there's a much larger contrast than here, which would be hard to detect with observations. And so these represent different C to O ratio models. The blue is a carbon-rich model, whereas this is a solar C to O ratio. And so the different molecular bands that correspond to oxygen and carbon-bearing molecules have different features when you change C to O ratio. And so this has been suggested as a way to sort of fundamentally characterize hot Jupiter exoplanets. And someone who's done a lot of work on this is Nick Madhusudan, who 2 years ago actually published another paper that was looking at how you might use kind of known condensation lines in an equilibrium protoplanetary disk, and how those change with time and whether it's in the gas and the solid to actually predict how hot Jupiter exoplanets formed. And so what they concluded from their simulations was that if you have a hot Jupiter exoplanet, and he's showing some of the measurements here of the oxygen abundance in the hot Jupiters, if it has a C to O ratio that's greater than solar, which is about 0.5, that might indicate that it formed via core accretion and then some sort of disk-free migration, so being scattered in or some sort of planet-planet interaction. Versus in this corner of the plot, where all of the different formation mechanisms all produce something that's less than solar. So that's not as distinguishing, but if you can find a hot Jupiter with a high C to O ratio, that could tell you something about how it formed, which is also interesting. So C to O in hot Jupiters, characterizing them now and maybe how they formed. Carbon to oxygen is interesting in terrestrial planets because, again, as I'm sure many of you know, that controls the distribution of controls the distribution of silicon between oxygen and carbide species. And so if you have something like a carbide planet with a Ceto ratio greater than about 0.8 or 1, you can have this graphite crust with perhaps a silicon carbide or titanium carbide layers. If there's carbon-rich compounds raining down on the surface, there might be these oceans of tar, carbonaceous compounds on the surface. If there's less oxygen, there might be less water. So plate tectonics and habitability might be decreased. And it was also suggested a few years ago that this exoplanet 55 Cancri E was a carbon-rich planet, and it could have a layer of diamond on the inside. So that's also very exotic and interesting. Here I'm just showing a simulation of solar system protoplanetary disk compositions, and then one disk of a carbon-rich composition, and you can see this bump in the dark purple, which is the carbon abundance in the disk. So if we were able to find these carbon-rich planets, that could be just very different than most everything in our solar system. But as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, determining exoplanet compositions, especially terrestrial exoplanet compositions, is very challenging. And so we're able to measure the Ceto ratio in the host star more reliably and for a larger sample, spanning many different types of stars and planets. So this is a plot from my paper in 2014, in which I measured the Ceto ratio. And here I have it plotted against the metallicity of these red points, which are a bunch of hot Jupiter host stars. So here I was trying to figure out whether there's any relationships between the carbon to oxygen ratio in the hot Jupiter host star atmospheres and any properties of the hot Jupiters themselves. I'll give away the punchline. There really wasn't any nice correlations that I saw. My sample was relatively small. I should also point out here that the dashed red line is the solar Ceto ratio. And these other points are from other papers. But one thing that I did learn from this was how measuring this carbon-oxygen ratio is actually not that straightforward and can be very tricky depending on what type of star you're dealing with, especially when it comes to cool metal-rich stars like this 55 Cancri host star. This was the host star of the Diamond Planet. And in his 2012 paper, Niku Madhusudan suggested, based on the density of the exoplanet, so here mass versus radius, it plots on this perhaps carbon-rich curve, and a previously measured Ceto ratio of the host star, which was above 1, he put those together and said this will be this carbon-rich diamond planet. But the previous measurement of the host star Ceto ratio, which I've circled here, was part of a larger ensemble. It's all those blue points and the red points in this plot. So it really wasn't treated sort of with the special care that was necessary for this type of star. And so I went back and did a much more detailed analysis of the spectrum of the star, using a lot of different oxygen and carbon indicators, trying to account for different effects that can influence the abundance that you measure in the different lines, and came to the conclusion that the Ceto ratio is actually significantly lower. It's more like 0.75 or 0.8, which is still on this boundary of carbon-rich possibility, but it's not so clearly a carbon-rich star. And so while that might influence the possibility of the planet being carbon-rich, it's still a very exciting system. There was actually a paper out just yesterday, that made phase curve observations of the planet, and so took the transit observations and the secondary eclipse observations and combined them to trace the planet over its entire orbit. And based on that, they suggested that it could be covered in molten or partially solidified lava. So it's still a very interesting system. And still, this applies, gathering as much information as possible about this small, interesting super-Earth. So one of the other takeaways from my work on Ceto ratios was that there actually aren't a lot of these carbon-rich host stars. This is perhaps an exception, but it could be as low as here based on the errors. And this was interesting, particularly kind of at this time, because there was this flurry of suggestions of carbon-rich planets, and what would those be like, and how could we measure, like I was talking about, the hot Jupiter carbon-rich atmospheres. But at least based on the host stars, my work suggests that there isn't going to be this huge population of carbon-rich systems, at least in terms of bulk composition. And so that was, I think, one of the major takeaways from this, and has been corroborated by other work since then. Yes?
Johanna, is there, I mean, it looks like there's a weak linear correlation between metallicity and
galactic chemical evolution effect. And so when you're moving you can almost think of metallicity as a time axis. When you're moving to more recent times, the production of carbon is tied more to low mass stars. And so when low mass stars are dying and letting off their carbon, you get an increase in the carbon to oxygen ratio.
So then the question I have is, how do you make old stars, or presumably relatively old stars, with C to O ratios that are greater than 1?
How would you do that?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't think you do.
So these are probably artifacts, all these high C to O ratios.
Oh yeah, these are not from my work. Yes, those are from another paper. The grade points are actually from the same paper that published the 55 Cancri results. So it was a large sample. I mean, I can understand that when you're measuring a large sample of stars, the measurement techniques might be different because it's just for practicality. But yeah, I don't think those are real. There.
Are any of those stars that have from the old studies that have high C to O, are any of those in your sample, or are they the same stars, or?
That's a good question. 55 Cancri certainly was. I would have to go back and check if there was any more overlap, but if that gives you any indication, it went from something like 1.1 to 0.8. So, and these, I should mention, these are all normalized to the same solar abundances, so they should be directly comparable. Okay, so talked about giant planet atmospheres. What about their interiors? There's a new project that I've been working on the last year with Jonathan Fortney from UCSC, where we're trying to understand whether host star abundances could be related or predictive of giant planet interiors and particularly the heavy element mass in them. And so we know in our solar system that Jupiter and Saturn do seem to be, both in their atmospheres and in their interiors, enhanced in heavy elements. And so is this also true in exoplanets, or giant exoplanets? In these studies, which I'm showing, this one is by Jonathan and his graduate student Daniel Thorngren, we're looking only at cool giant planets, so ones that don't have this artificial radius enhancement that we see for the very close-in hot Jupiters. They're puffier than they should be, and we don't really understand why yet. But that's not something we're considering here. We're just focusing on the cooler ones, so that they're able to use more simplified interior structure models to go from masses and radii to densities and heavy element mass contents of the planets. And so in the top plot on the left, Daniel's plotted the planet mass, these are all Jupiter masses, versus the heavy element mass and Earth masses. And the blue points are just circumbinary planets. And there's a pretty nice correlation there between heavy element mass in the planet and how big the planet is. So maybe that would be expected or intuitive, but there isn't such a tight correlation between the heavy element mass and the host star metallicity. The blue points in this plot were from Jonathan's original paper in 2011. Now there's a lot more of these red points and the correlation seems weaker. This is one thing I want to work on actually. The metallicities that they've used for this paper are just from literature, and I've already shown that I can improve upon some of those, and so I think this might get tighter. But this was not super promising in terms of being able to connect giant planet interiors and host star abundances. However, in this plot, Daniel has shown this is now planet mass versus what he's called the Z planet, which is the heavy element enhancement in the giant planet. So that's basically amount of heavy elements over amount of hydrogen and helium. And then in this plot, this is the same quantity, but then plotted over Z star, and going from here to here, the correlation gets tighter. And so this perhaps suggests that there is some connection between the star and the planet metallicities. And so this is something we wanted to explore more, again, going beyond just iron, because a priori, why would there be a reason that giant planet interiors would be connected somehow to iron? Based on how we think they form, you might expect there to be more correlated with carbon or oxygen abundances if they form from ices, or maybe silicon abundances if there's a rocky core component. So this is a work in progress, but I just wanted to show you what we have so far. So this is now basically the same plot as the heavy element mass versus parent star metallicity, but instead of just iron, I'm also showing carbon, oxygen, magnesium, silicon, and nickel. And here are the size of the points. Yeah, sorry.
When you talk about the mass of the heavy elements in
Yes.
the planet, how is that being determined? Is that from density, or is that?
It is, yes. It's from density. So all these planets that are in the sample have masses and radii constrained, and they're using, I think, a 3-layer model with an inert core, some sort of envelope, and then another layer on top of that, I think, for the modeling of just the interior of the giant exoplanet. So yes, that's definitely model dependent.
And then your data are?
From the star. Does that make sense? Okay, right. So these are planet, metal mass in the planet versus different abundances in the stars. And so you can see in all these plots we're sort of missing data in this part. So we're looking to fill in more of the low metal mass exoplanets, but it's also challenging to get data in this low abundance range because as you go to lower abundances, the lines become weaker and it's harder to get accurate abundances. But I'm hopeful that we'll be able to fill in more points here and maybe be able to see whether there's actual correlations here increasing with abundance and metal mass in the planets. Daniel made this plot for me, which is a kind of copy of this one where we have metal mass versus Z planet over Z star. In these plots, Z planet is the same quantity, but instead of a Z star based on the iron abundance of the star, he's now plotted a Z star based on the carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, magnesium, and silicon abundances. And the takeaway from this is also that we need more data, especially at these low mass planet ranges, which we've just proposed to get more data on with Keck. And I'll also ask for more Magellan time to get these abundances. But what I think is interesting from this is that there does seem to, especially, it's hard to see, I'm sure, from the back, but based on the errors, these points and these points have lower errors than these. And so if you did an error-weighted fit, I can see that there might be kind of step functions in a lot of these plots. And where, at what planet mass those step functions drop might be different for these different elements, or might be more smooth for some elements versus others. And so that's something I'm interested in investigating more with more data. So, yes?
So I mean, this is all very interesting, but if we just look at the solar systems and how those data is going to plot along those diagrams.
Where would the solar system plot?
Yeah, now solar system, we have more information about the solar spectrum.
Sure.
And we also know the planet have the mass.
Sure, right.
Strips all those information we know.
Right.
Just purely from the observational point of view, and where were those?
Right. So on this plot up here, and I don't have them. These plots are sort of analogous. They're plotting the same thing. The blue points are Jupiter and Saturn. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. It's sort of hard to see. Maybe easier here. Jupiter and Saturn. So they follow very well the rest of the exoplanets in the iron-based plot. In terms of the other elements, I think I could probably plot Jupiter and Saturn on the carbon plot, but I'm not sure that we have good constraints on the other abundances, like especially oxygen, in the Jupiter and Saturn atmospheres. But you're right, it would be very good to try to calibrate this with our own solar system data because it's much more detailed and has lower errors, certainly. Any other questions? Okay, so I've talked all about giant planets, which are really cool, and I'm excited to do more, but really what I'm interested in is the small planets. And so I talked at the beginning about this giant planet metallicity correlation and trying to figure out whether there's any other signpost of small planet formation. There doesn't seem to be, or the metallicity correlation seems to be either non-existent or smaller. There was a paper out in 2009 by Jorge Melendez, and this suggested that there might be this signature of small planet formation if you look at a suite of elements and how their condensation temperature, the suite of elements based on their condensation temperature, and how their abundances compare relative to the sun. And so in this plot, he's showing the sun solar abundances minus an average of 10 solar twins that he measured. So these are stars that are very similar to the sun in most of their properties, except perhaps a little bit elemental abundances. And basically what he finds is that these high condensation temperature refractory elements seem to be less abundant in the sun versus solar twin stars. And what Jorge suggested was that this could actually be a signature of the small planet formation in our solar system. John Chambers had a paper out the next year that quantified this a little bit more, showing that if you added different amounts of different material masses back into the sun with its current convection zone size, you could, if you used a mixture of Earth and CM conduit material, you could match the mean solar twin trend that Jorge found. And so perhaps that this could be a signature of these 4 Earth masses of material that were not in our sun because they're in the small planets in our solar system. This would be really cool because small planets are hard to find by any method, transit or rate of velocity. And so if there was a signature that we could use just or determine just by observing their host stars, that could be very powerful. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. There are lots of other variables that influence trends like this. Things like age of the star and the galactic position, how it's moved through the galaxy through time, the environment close by the star, so whether there have been nearby supernovae, and then also just how the gas and dust separate in the protoplanetary disk, which is going to be different for every star. I've also done some work on this, kind of looking from the flip side, looking at stars that we know have small planets from Kepler, and seeing if they show the predicted abundance trend. And so far, we would predict that if these stars had small planets and this signature were true, then their lines would be going down or relatively flat. And we can show statistically that they're not. Most of them are going upwards. And this is work that I've done with one of my thesis advisors, Simon Schuler. So basically, known small planet host stars don't show the predicted trend. We're working to increase this sample to increase its significance, but it's not good news for this idea that you can detect small planets just based on the host star condensation temperature trends. However, binary stars to the rescue. All those things that I showed that could complicate the picture for solar twins might not be the case in these binary stars. If they form from the same material, you might expect that they have the same composition. If they don't, could that be a signature of planet formation around one or the other? Could that be material that's missing from one of the stars that could be in the giant planet core or in small planets? Could it be material that was added to stars either by giant planet migrating inward and pushing material onto the star or planet-planet scattering? So there's, I think, a lot to explore with these systems. Right now, there are only a handful of these binary host star systems that we can study in detail. It's very important that the stars themselves, it's not just any binary, and they have to host planets, obviously, or host known planets, and then also be very, very similar in their spectral type and properties. That basically allows us to use the same stellar model to interpret the abundances, and that cancels out a lot of the potential errors that you get when comparing stellar abundances differentially. So they really have to be binary twins that host exoplanets. In the past, it was suggested that signature or a difference in abundances of something like 0.02 depths in a binary star system was unusual, would be indicative of something going on there. That's based on papers that were in the early 2000s, so we're building upon that. But I wanted to highlight a couple of cases that I've done in the past year or so, looking at these binary host stars. This was the first one that I worked on, which is EXO2 North and EXO2 South. EXO2 North has a transiting hot Jupiter exoplanet. It was actually one of the first hot Jupiters detected, very close in. And then the southern component has these other planets, one less massive, one more massive, both with moderate eccentricities, also a little bit farther out in their orbits, and not transiting. These are detected via rate of velocity. And what's really cool about this system and the abundance work on this is that really until this point, there have been a couple of papers that had shown no differences or no significant differences between binary host star abundances. And one system, 16 sig, A and B, that some people said there were differences and some people said there weren't. So in that case, there wasn't any agreement. But with my paper and then 2 others that came out after it, we all came to a very similar conclusion using different data and different analysis techniques. So that's kind of speaks to the power of independent analyses and perhaps interesting things going on in this system. And so I'll just walk you through these very quickly. This is a plot from my paper. I was also trying to test how dependent our results were on different stellar models, and so that's what the different color points are. The important takeaway from this, where I'm plotting the condensation temperature, or excuse me, the elements versus the element difference between the 2 stars versus their condensation temperature. And I find that in the northern component, so in this host star, it's enhanced relative to the southern component in silicon, iron, and nickel. Ivan Ramirez, in his paper that came out very soon after that, showed that this was the case, but that there's also an enhancement in the volatiles, and that there's this trend with the refractory element enhancement in the northern component. And then a similar paper came out showing basically the same result. So these two stars are significantly different. The northern component has slightly more volatiles, and then this trend with more abundance in refractories. How you interpret this is, I think, still very much an open question, and I've heard people argue about it. So I don't want to dwell on that too much, but you can speculate about why the northern star would have more refractory elements, which means that either its planet has less refractory elements in it, or perhaps in the migration of this planet inwards, it pushed refractory material onto the star, and that has polluted the star's atmosphere. So yeah, there's several different ways to interpret this, but I think the takeaway from this is that these papers all agree on the signature of enhancement in one of the stars versus the other. The next system that I worked on was this WASP 94A and B, and this was a very different system from the EXO2 system because these are much hotter stars. So EXO2 was cool and metal rich. These are much hotter and a little bit metal enhanced above solar. In this case, the A star has a transiting planet, but the planet is misaligned and probably orbiting in retrograde, so the opposite way versus the stellar spin, which means something happened there dynamically. We don't think that planets just form like that. And then in the B component, there's a slightly more massive, slightly closer in exoplanet that is not transiting. And again, here, I worked with Ivan and also his undergraduate student at Santa Canal to analyze spectra from Magellan, Mike, of this star. And not only were our spectra very high resolution, very good quality, but we all did independent analyses of the data. All the measurements were independent. And so then we were able to combine them and decrease our error bars. And that was good because the signature is very small and different than any of the other systems in that we find this depletion in volatiles in the A component, but a slight enhancement in refractories. Whereas in the EXO2 system, one of the stars was enhanced in both volatiles and refractories. Again, there are different ways to interpret this data. I think one of the takeaways was that, as Phil Plait said, he's a bad astronomer, whatever happened, this is an odd system. Why did these two twin stars form apparently very different planets, especially in their orbital configurations? And one of the things that I suggest in my paper is that this actually might be tied to something about stellar astrophysics. These stars are sort of on the border of where the convection zone of the star is thought to be not large enough to help damp planetary orbits as they're migrating inwards. And so when you look and see around what types of stars these misaligned planets form, a lot of them are very hot stars. And so perhaps this B is actually slightly cooler than A. And so perhaps we're just right at this boundary of a difference in planet formation based on host star mass and temperature. So I thought that was very exciting and kind of an unexpected result from this paper. So now I'll talk about new radial velocity planets that are in one of these binary twins that have been detected around stars with Magellan PFS. So this is my first planet detection paper. I say mine, but really, obviously, it's this huge team effort. I'm just the person who took the time to write it up. And so this is a snapshot of the system. We have these two stars, and the A component has two fairly massive planets with moderate eccentricities on actually relatively wide orbits. And then the B star has a pretty massive planet, pretty high eccentricity actually, on an even longer orbit. And so what's really cool about, and then here I'm showing the rate of velocity measurements versus time, and then these two bottom plots are the residuals. I should point out here that we use two different instruments, and so the red points in this plot are the same instrument as the blue points in this plot. And the scale here is 40 to minus 40, and you can't even see the error bars. The scale here is 4 to minus 4, so it's kind of zoomed in, really just showing off how amazing the PFS instrument is on Magellan for detecting planets. It's also amazing because these planets are fairly long period. I'll show a plot in a sec that gives you an idea of that scale. And so really the only reason we're able to detect them is because of the long baseline that PFS has had. It's been on Magellan since 2010. And before that we were using, or Paul was using Mike, which is what these blue points are on Magellan. So really it's not only the precision of PFS, but the long time baseline that made these detections possible. So of course, I wanted to know if stars were the same or different in their abundances. The top plot here, I have the different elements just in each star, not the two stars relative to each other. So this is just relative to solar. And you can see, just looking kind of across here, that a lot of the elements are around minus 0.3 dex. So this is a pretty metal poor star, actually. It's also very old. It's something like 9.78 years. It's very similar in temperature to the sun, but in its kind of overall metallicity and elemental abundances, it's depleted. And then this plot shows the two stars compared to each other. You can focus on the orange points here, and this dashed green line is 0. And so if you follow the orange points, which are A minus V, you can see that the A star, they have about the same amount of volatile, low condensation temperature material, but the A star seems to be depleted in refractory elements. So again, why would this be? Can I use properties of the system to explain this? Yeah, these stars are different. Why? Again, I don't want to be too speculative and too specific about how I'm trying to explain this, but one thing you can do is look at the masses of the planets around both stars. A is basically missing about 0.5 or 0.6 Jupiter masses of material versus V in terms of the planets that orbit them. And so could that explain this difference? So making a simple assumption about the planet metallicity, how much heavy elements there are in the planet, and this first situation at the top is when there's potentially late accretion or depletion of material from either of the stars. So the red circle inside the orange circle is supposed to represent the convection zone of the star. And that, when I do sort of a back of the envelope calculation, that gives a delta abundance difference that is about 0.1 dex, which is too high. I measure something about a third of that. If you kind of rewind and do an earlier timing accretion or depletion when the convection zones are smaller, then that might work. That gives a abundance difference of about 0.03 dex. So that could work. Again, knowing what I know from the Thorngren and Fortney paper about exoplanet heavy metal amounts, I can do something a little bit more sophisticated and use the planet mass versus heavy element mass in the planet's relationship that they derived, and use the planet masses that I've measured to do the same calculation, but with a slightly more realistic ZP value. And in this case, if I do late timing, I get something that's a little bit too high, and if I do early timing, something that's much too low. But maybe that sort of brackets the time. So this is something like 15 million years, and this is the present age of the star. That brackets the times in which this accretion or depletion could have occurred. That's a very large time span, so that's not super constraining. Plus, there could be things like material being sort of injected into the stellar atmosphere, things being ejected. So especially in these systems that have some sort of eccentricity, that might point towards smaller bodies being ejected from the system because only the massive ones remain. There could be uncertainties in these giant planet interior relations that Daniel Thorngren has derived. And in fact, they have this planet mass versus heavy element mass relation, but they also have a host star versus heavy element relation. And when I use our host star metallicity, which is depleted, it's minus 0.3, I get a different heavy element mass expected for the interior of the planet. So there's some mismatch there. And also, there could be other planets. Steve Vogt thinks there's another planet around the B star that would actually make up for the mass difference. So still an open question, and we're working on it. But the takeaway from all of these is that these binary stars are really interesting systems to study, and I'm working on getting more of them, which I'll say in a few minutes.
How rare are they?
Hmm?
How rare are they?
How rare are they?
Are binary systems with planets?
That's a very good question that I have in another talk, that I answer in another talk. We think binary exoplanet host stars are about as common as binary stars that don't necessarily host exoplanets. It's a little bit dependent on their separation and the mass of the planets. We actually don't have that very well constrained for small mass exoplanets, but for giant exoplanets, And
I think a lot of them would be ejected.
for closely separated binaries, the fraction is lower, but once you get beyond about a few hundred AU, then the fraction of binaries is about the same. So, I just wanted to close with how this system that I've been profiling from PFS is sort of at the extreme. All the planets fall within this square, so they're right on this edge of directly imaged planets. So we're sort of pushing that boundary in terms of the long period planets, what we can detect with radial velocity. And I think I also, here the color bar is metallicity, and so I think the B planet plots like somewhere right in here, so there's really only one or two host stars with similarly long period exoplanets that are also massive. So it's just a new parameter space that we're starting to probe with PFS, and so that's exciting. So I will conclude with talking about more extreme exoplanets, now kind of moving into the small planet regime. We've been doing this in the lab, which is very different for me. Usually I'm at the telescope or at my computer. And this was motivated by this idea that you can infer small planet composition or something about planet composition from host star abundances. And this is just an example of that, a paper from last year, where they took host star abundances, assumed those were the abundances in a protoplanetary disk, modeled the growth of planets in the disks, and got these pretty nice correlations between the planet iron to silicon and magnesium to silicon ratios versus the star for a range of different planet masses. On these plots, it's sort of hard to see anything but the giant planets, which are the dark squares, but they're covering up the smaller planets. So if we think that there's a pretty good correlation between these ratios in the star versus the planet interiors, we can look at the variety of star abundance ratios that we get. And so these are two plots, aluminum to silicon versus magnesium to silicon, and this one is calcium. These are compiled by the undergraduate student Janelli, which was what she did all the last semester, basically. And we chose kind of these extreme ratios in both of these spaces to construct, and so this is a lot of work that basically Colin has done, construct a sample of the interior of an exoplanet that had one of these sort of extreme compositions. And then we have been exposing it to high pressure and high temperature and seeing what mineral phases we get out and what the structure is. And so this is kind of our first very successful experiment. It's like experiment 5 or 6, so we had some challenges before that. But now this is showing an SEM analysis focusing on magnesium. And so at the top, this is what would represent the melt or crust in our exoplanet, extreme exoplanet, terrestrial exoplanet. And then this is the mantle, and you can see different kind of shaped structures, and here's crystallization. Here I'm showing aluminum and calcium, and so all of that has moved into the melt. And so next, we're going to be doing these experiments with the piston cellar at different pressures, and then maybe eventually different temperatures, to kind of see at what point this is not as much in the melt phase of the material. So this is also ongoing work, but I think really exciting, and I don't know anyone else that's doing something like this. So pretty cutting edge as well. Oh, that doesn't look right. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll tell you what my next steps are. So in terms of the Cool Jupiter project, we're getting more host star abundances from Keck and from Magellan. I'm also getting more abundances of stars known to host small rocky planets, and that number will only increase with both people reanalyzing Kepler data and also the extended mission of Kepler called K2. There's several other missions being launched to find small transiting planets, so we'll follow those up with Magellan PFS. And also, I'm hoping to do a systematic abundance analysis of all the stars that we have PFS spectra for, because it's a very large sample, to perhaps use kind of statistical analyses to tease out more trends with small planet presence and composition of host stars. There's about 50 other binary stars to investigate in the Carnegie RV catalog. So I'm hoping to do abundance analyses of at least some of those. There's also a sample that I've been working on with Yvonne Ramirez that are binary stars that are not known to host planets, so we can sort of calibrate what difference you would expect if there weren't planets, to tell us whether differences we're measuring are actually significant. And then, like I said, we're going to vary our experiments with the high magnesium to silicon ratio extreme. See if this works. Yes.
You have binary slides too.
I sort of do have binary slide. So then sort of farther in the future, I'm really interested in doing more with the host star CETO ratios and maybe comparing the CETO ratio in stars to disks around those stars, perhaps directly image planet atmospheres. I've already done a little bit of work with the CETO and brown dwarf atmospheres. So there's lots of ways to use this as a really good tool for comparing different bodies in planetary systems. I'm working with several people on the NASA ROSES proposal for feeding these detailed abundances into small planet host stars into a more complex planet interior evolution models than really what's been done before. Then I'm also interested maybe in comparing abundances of main sequence stars to their polluted white dwarf companion atmospheres. So these main sequence white dwarf systems, trying to see if their abundances are different. Also, I'm interested in sort of exoplanets through time, looking at the extreme composition of exoplanets that have very low metallicities. It's been shown that once you get to low iron contents, it does seem like a lot of exoplanet host stars are enhanced in things like titanium and silicon, and so doing more work on that I think would be useful, and illuminating in terms of how especially small planets form and evolve through the history of our galaxy. Also additional non-exoplanetary things, especially at Carnegie Observatories where there really isn't anyone else that does exoplanets, but that's okay. So this is my last slide, main takeaways. What are all these exoplanets made of? Hopefully I've convinced you that using stellar abundances as one of those 3 types of observations is useful and informative for trying to answer this question. Determining carbon and oxygen abundances in stars is more precise than what we can get in exoplanet atmospheres and certainly interiors right now, but it's still challenging and really requires multiple indicators and high quality data and detailed analysis. Host star abundances can be compared to planet properties. It can strain kind of where and from what material the disk or the planet's formed. And also, as I talked about with the giant planets, perhaps their interior composition. Binary host stars have a very important role to play in extending these correlations between stellar composition and the presence of planets or the composition of planets. And then I just really wanted to emphasize that Carnegie is uniquely positioned to make significant progress in understanding the diversity of exoplanets, both in terms of observational resources and the theoretical resources and then experimental resources. So it's been my great pleasure to be doing this work at Carnegie. And I will stop there and take any questions.
Questions? Yeah.
So it's very interesting. You're looking at the different compositions. Look at this silicon and iron and calcium and aluminum.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is, those are really how you can tie to your observations, because what you're looking at is the evolution of the mantle, maybe crust, which is far from what you can actually observe and be able to compare and resolve.
Yeah.
What more interesting is probably look at extreme in the composition, like oxygen content, for example. So you really can look at the core mantle differentiations. When you're without oxygen, what kind of differentiation process of the planet will occur? Or if you have a completely oxidized planet, and what would it look like? So
Yes,
also
yeah.
will be, eventually maybe be able to tie the to your density observations and building a new planet and be able to do direct comparisons.
Yeah, that's a great point, and especially in terms of atmospheric content. For a lot of what people are excited about for JWST and sort of these next generation telescopes is measuring exoplanet atmospheres and pushing to smaller and smaller exoplanets that we can learn something about their atmospheric composition and how that's tied to the interior composition. That might be kind of an observation experiment connection too. Yeah.
Yeah, going back to the abundance trends
Yes.
with the composition temperature, some of the stars. And you said a lot of people have put forward alternative explanations that have nothing to do with planet formation.
Yes.
Could you just briefly discuss which of those would specifically give you a trend with condensation temperature?
So I think what's been put forth in terms of especially age and galactic position or galactic chemical evolution is that if you're just looking at stars compared to the sun, those could have formed at different times, and so have different, like I mentioned to Larry, these different abundance ratios, and so that could mimic the trends that you see, especially for a lot of the ones I showed. It's not a very clear trend. There are some outliers, and so it's not super linear. And so trying to, I guess, sort of overinterpret the data, that could not be a signature due to planets. In terms of the, Eric Gatos was the main person who put forward something about dust. What did I say? It was like basically different dust condensation within the protoplanetary disk. And so I think he found, based on his simulations, that could mimic this signature that you see in the host star abundances. That's still sort of related to the formation of planets, but a lot of the non-exoplanet explanations have been based on much larger studies of host star or non-host star abundances, if that makes sense, looking at the trends with age.
Presumably most galactic chemical evolution trends wouldn't necessarily give you a correlation with condensation.
Absolutely not, but they could change the slope of it. They could, yeah. I think that's the takeaway.
Connell.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up quickly on John's thing, it's very difficult to fractionate those elements in sort of, at least the conventional way we would condense things out of the gas and dust. But I also wanted to follow up on your differences between the different similar binaries.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that what you're seeing is not planet formation per se, but it's a disk process? It's a slight difference in disk processes, for instance, different disk winds.
Yeah.
That might be fractionating away your volatiles from your rocky elements, things like that.
Absolutely. That could, I mean, the base assumption that I'm going from is that the stars started out the same and then something changed. If they didn't start out the same or something is happening different in their evolution, certainly that could cause abundant signature differences. But what's key about this is the stars are basically the same spectral type. And so you would expect them to have basically the same kind of behavior throughout their lifetimes, if that sort of makes sense. And so that one would have much stronger solar winds than the other, I would think might not be that likely.
I wasn't thinking of solar winds, but disk winds.
Oh, yes.
And
Yeah.
sort of evaporation.
Yeah, that could be. Whether that would, I mean, yeah, it depends on the magnitude of the signature that you're detecting. For a lot of these, it's pretty small. It's tenths of a deck, so yeah, perhaps.
First of all, completely blown away by the scope of the research. This is really like wow work. I wanted to go back to the point you mentioned about the possibility of being able to infer planets by just the change in chemical composition and refractory depletion in the star. One of the nascent fields of planet detection is astrometry, where it's the case that you have a very low mass star and a very high mass planet. So I would imagine that depletions would be greater. So do you see that trend has any more promise towards lower mass stars? I mean, you mentioned it was inconclusive, but
Right.
do you see any hint that this could be helpful?
So I think, yeah, right now the sample is very small, so it's hard to say.